Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, meteorologist Brian McNoldy joins us on the podcast again for a look ahead at the 2025 hurricane season. We also talk about how last year's unprecedented heat played out in an extremely active season, and about how climate change is less about individual events and year-over-year comparisons, and more about the overall picture of how things are evolving over time. Let's listen. Brian McNoldy, welcome back to Public Health on Call. How are you?
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm doing great.
So we had you on a year ago. It was July 2024. And at that time, we talked about how your field was really having to evolve because to some degree, your work depends on weather patterns and understanding past data. And we're kind of in this era of shattering a lot of these records. And a lot of our conversation boiled down to expect the unpredictable, expect the unexpected. I think we've really seen that in the last year. So walk us through how that's played out since we last spoke.
Certainly, yeah. Going into last hurricane season, we had this unprecedented two-pronged look at what was coming up. And one, we had expectations of La Nina to develop, and La Nina generally acts to enhance Atlantic hurricane activity. And we also had pretty ridiculous ocean temperatures across the tropical Atlantic. To say record-breaking would be an understatement. So extremely warm water. So the two of those factors really had never been observed before together. And so just to fast forward a little bit, the expected La Nina didn't quite come in quite as forecast. It was pretty weak. It just clicked into La Nina territory. The ocean temperatures did stay extremely warm, though. And the 2024 hurricane season ended up extremely active. It was not just active in terms of numbers of storms and intensities of storms, but very impactful, too. So the 2024 hurricane season for the U.S. was the third costliest on record, behind 2017 and 2005. So very, very impactful, very active. Two Category 5 hurricanes out there during the year. First one was the earliest Category 5 by 2 weeks, really pretty astounding.
So how are some of these factors shaping up looking into this hurricane season?
Well, fortunately, neither one of those are true right now. So we're looking at probably a much more close to average season in terms of overall activity. The water temperatures are still fairly warm, especially in the western part of the Atlantic. The eastern's actually a little cooler than normal right now, but that also doesn't really come into play until September, October anyway, so we don't have to worry about that yet. And then we're also probably just going to stay in the neutral phase, so not El Nino or La Nina, so just right in between, which, as you might expect then, really has a neutral effect on hurricane activity. So that being said, if we end up with a slightly above average season in terms of overall activity, that still doesn't predict what specific impacts there might be from a certain hurricane, of course.
And is there anything, for example, like when you talked about last year being the costliest on record, so that was both the size of the storms and perhaps where they're occurring. Have you seen some aberrations in that?
So yeah, last year was third costliest behind 2017, 2005. And that's a significant reason for numbers like that. Anytime you get extremely costly hurricanes, it's not so much because of the intensity of the storm, it's where it hits. So if it manages to hit and affect highly populated regions, those numbers are going to climb, both in fatalities usually, but certainly in cost. And so we did have that. There was a significant impact in Florida from two hurricanes, at least. And then, of course, we had Hurricane Helene, which was moving very quickly northward through the Gulf of Mexico, kind of just plowed into the southeast U.S. and brought its very heavy rain that all hurricanes have, and brought that very far north into South Carolina, North Carolina. Of course, all the main stories and main fatalities from that hurricane were actually in western North Carolina. So it's a good lesson, too, in something that I try to enforce, I guess, a lot, or reinforce, is that hurricanes don't end when they make landfall. There's so much hype and climax around when is landfall, where is landfall. Da, da, da. Well, there's still often 1, 2, 3, 4 days left of impacts left after landfall. And as we saw with Hurricane Helene, that's an important lesson to remember.
Yeah, and I also wanted to shift the topic a little bit. When we think about climate change, and what we've talked with you in the past is around like these big storms that have a lot of coverage and cause really, really widespread devastation. But one of the major concerns that I'm hearing more and more about now is heat. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is definitely an increasingly important topic. And actually, just to quickly tie it in with hurricanes, that's one of the greatest post-hurricane threats, not only on the coast, but inland when people lose electricity for anywhere from a day to a month. It's generally occurring in August, September, the months you don't want to be without air conditioning in Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, so on. So heat is definitely a tremendous impact in the post-hurricane timeframe. But in the more general sense, one of the changes we're seeing with heat across the board, this is not just specific to any location, is there's maybe a slight trend in the high temperatures, but there's a much more significant trend in the low temperatures. So the overnight lows are warming at a disproportionate rate. And so even though those aren't the super extremes, they are what gives relief and some sort of normalcy that you get, hopefully, during the night and early morning hours. And those are getting somewhat eroded. And more places are worse than others. I know in like Southeast Florida, I've looked at pretty extensively. There, it's becoming fairly common that the heat index, which is the combination of the temperature and the humidity, which in a place like that, you have to account for the humidity, trust me, where the heat index can still be in the upper 80s to 90 even throughout most of the night. It's pretty awful. And it didn't used to be that way. I've looked at this trends over the last 50 years, and it has absolutely changed.
How does the not having the low to counterbalance a high during the day, how does that impact weather on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it does have an influence. So when you have those higher humidity levels and higher temperatures, it does keep the atmosphere a little more unstable, which can allow for increased occurrences of storms and heavy rain and things like that.
And since we last talked, you personally have actually made a geographical move across the U.S., and you went from one of those very hot, humid places to a place that's very dry in New Mexico. And so there's another thing I want to ask about, and that's we are seeing more and more wildfires and broad impacts of things like wildfires.
Yeah, that's going to be, I think, an ongoing trend too. The thing about climate change, it's not something that's incrementally always getting worse or something. It's not like this year's going to be worse than last year and next year's going to be worse. There is still a lot of year-to-year fluctuation in weather. I mean, that's never going to stop. And I think that message sometimes gets lost, or sometimes intentionally lost, that, it's cool this year. What happened to global warming? Yes, there is still noise in the system. There's still wiggles, but the trend is absolutely there. Like, there's no denying. You can look at pretty much anything and find the trend of it. So as far as wildfires go, one of the things that we expect with climate change, again, on the large scale, on the trend scale, is extremes getting more extreme. The places that are wet get wetter, places that are dry get drier, and so on and so on. So when you're in a dry climate that's already prone to wildfires, the odds are good that threat is going to increase with time.
Is there any correlation between places that get wetter and then having wildfires? I think I'm thinking specifically about places like California, where you might have a year that's exceptionally wet and the greenery just goes crazy, and then you have a year that's exceptionally dry and all of that greenery burns away. I mean, is that what you mean by in terms of extremes?
Yeah, that is a part of it. And that's a great example out there, because they really do get feast or famine in terms of rainfall. They can get those very localized, the atmospheric river, those plumes of moisture that come up from the tropics, stream into the West Coast and just dump tremendous amounts of rain, which can be good because they can end droughts, they can put out fires, that's great. Then they also end up creating flash floods. It's like you go from one extreme to the other quickly. And then as you said, that promotes a ton of new growth, and that's great. But then a year or two later, if you're back into an exceptional drought and things are crispy, you've just created that much more crispy vegetation.
So in this conversation, what is it that you hope that people can take away? You said a few things about what we see overall from trends, but if there's one thing you hope that people are learning about climate change, what is that message?
Well, I think it is related to just appreciating the big picture of it, that it's not something that you can point to a single event and say, oh, that's because of climate change, or this year's hotter than last year, and that's climate change. You have to look at it from a zoomed out perspective and let it evolve on timescales that are meaningful. Like one specific event, 1 year to another, is not really the way to interpret it on either side. I know there's people that like to make that point to either pro or con, I guess, but it is absolutely happening. There's absolutely everything in the Earth system, from oceans to land, everywhere it's observed. But it's just understanding how it works. It's not a super specific event or super specific time.
That's really helpful. Brian McNoldy, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.